DMA Vox Populi, where underrepresented voices have a chance to be heard. Episode 2, The Occupied Web. John, you are a software engineer. How did you end up doing digital policy in the general interest on top of your day job?
I'm a software engineer and I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Crypty. About 2 years ago, Apple wanted to try to kill web apps, and they used European Commission's DMA as an excuse. I reached out to a bunch of amazing folks at Open Web Advocacy and I got involved and I've been doing this ever since. My platform is intentionally not on the app stores because I never wanted to give Apple or Google 30% of the commission. We intentionally decided that we're going to ship only web apps. And so this was very important for me to be able to stay as a web app. Progressive web apps are web apps you can install on your devices, on your iPhone, on your Android, on your desktop, any operating platform. They act and behave like native apps. So essentially you can install, for example, Spotify as a progressive web app. They are distributed via the browser, via the internet, without the need of an app store. They essentially work like native apps. You don't need to see the browser interface, and they can work offline. They have all the cool features that most native apps do. Once they're installed, you can get notifications and all these cool things. In the case of Spotify, you can listen to music and have it in the background. All the cool things that you would expect apps to do, you can do it with progressive web apps. And what we love about this is that we don't need to depend on gatekeepers. We don't need to pay them 30%. I don't need to get Apple's permission to push an update. I can do it 5 times a day if I want to. It's really fast. And you don't need to tell your users, hey, you're already on my website. You can just click this button and start using this app. But nope, sorry, you have to go to the App Store, download it there, come back again, and all those loopholes that all these gatekeepers have introduced. You don't need any of these things. With web apps, you're right there. You can use it. I think a little bit of it is just educating the users and making them know and aware of the possibilities that, hey, you can actually do this exact same thing with a web app and it'll be 30% cheaper. One of my favorite examples of this from recent history is Tinder is good with their web apps. And they've actually made it possible so that if you purchase Tinder's subscriptions inside the native apps, it's 30% more expensive. But if you purchase it on their website, it's actually 30% cheaper. And they've slowly incentivized their users to adopt the use of the web app by making their services a lot cheaper on the web apps rather than the native apps. So I think we need a bit more user education like this.
Alex, can you please tell us how Open Web Advocacy was formed, what it does, and why its work matters?
Probably to tell you about how we formed, we have to go all the way back to the late 90s. We really had 2 ecosystems for consumers, and that was Windows and Mac OS, with Windows being the much larger market share. Then what happened was the web gradually started occupying a greater percentage of user time as the years went on. And now we've got to the point where 70% of all desktop software is done a tab in a browser or looks like a native app, but is actually a web app inside. So that was great. And then in 2007, Apple came out with the iPhone, which is arguably the first, effective smartphone. And most people don't know this, but the first apps on iPhone were actually web apps. And Steve Jobs did this great speech where he said, you don't need an app store. There's no complicated procedure. If you want to distribute software, you just stick it on your website. There's no SDK required. And what it meant is that the apps that you built for Windows and Mac OS would automatically work with some mobile edits on the iPhone as well. Then the following year, they changed the distribution model for software. They said, instead of just being able to go to a website and download the software and install it, you have to get the software just from us, not get it from anywhere else, and we're going to take a 30% cut of every single piece of software. Then they added another clause which said nobody else is allowed to ship their browsers to iOS. You have to build a new browser around a component that we control, and you can't upgrade or modify. And what they did is they then invested lots of money in the native app ecosystem and very, very little in their browser, which meant the native app ecosystem got better and better, and the web ecosystem just got a tiny bit better. So this kept on going all the way to 2020. And what happened was, because of the underinvestment in Safari, the situation had got so bad that Safari was full of bugs. You couldn't build reliable applications in it. There's missing critical features. And so we just as developers start petitioning Apple. We're like, Apple, we need these features because we can't build apps without it. Safari's too buggy, you need a bigger budget. And we got stonewalled. And eventually we just realized that we weren't going to get anywhere. And we decided, well, there's only one other solution, and that's we've got to go to government, specifically regulators, to ask them if they can fix the problem. And so quite naively, I thought it would be, type a few emails to a regulator. Here's the problem, you guys go solve it, job done. But then 5 years later, it kind of snowballed, and now we've got a full non-profit, and we're trying to battle regulatory region by regulatory region to get some sort of unified regulations that are actually effective in solving this problem. The web already has a very close-knit community who are very passionate. Almost every single person who works on the web, no matter what company they work for, pretty much every single engineer who works on the web believes in the web and believes it is the platform of the future. And because of that, and because the community has really quite a clear vision of where we want the web to go, it's not very hard to go and talk to people in the community and go like, this isn't working well, we need your help. And this has happened many times throughout the web's history, where the web community has got together and solved a particular problem. Obviously, we couldn't do it without the support that we get. Particular technical details of something, overly specific and narrow, or review one of our documents for mistakes, or help build our website. And so having that community just helps a lot.
How does the open web support the goals of the DMA and similar digital regulation regimes around the world, in your opinion?
That's a good question. And I think it really comes down to, when you talk about the open web, it is really the only existing scalable, interoperable, cross-platform competitive constraint on the mobile operating systems and App Store gatekeepers. Because if you talk about the DMA's core aims, testability, fairness, interoperability, user choice, all of those line up perfectly with what a healthy web delivers. Now, the other thing the web delivers is much lower switching costs. And that's because you get lower development costs because you write once, deploy everywhere. You have a reduced dependency on app stores. You don't have to pay gatekeeper fees. The apps work automatically on third-party devices. And really, so if you're talking about like a clear route to challenging the Apple and Google duopoly, then having a middleware layer that works across those operating systems is our best bet. And then if you talk about what the downstream consumer benefits of this is going to be, be lower prices, better innovation, higher quality software, and again, less lock-in and a better chance for a new operating system or device ecosystems to emerge. And one of the competitive pressures is we need new phone ecosystems, but to support those phone ecosystems, they need a library of apps that support them.
What's amazing about the web is that it doesn't require you to have a multi-million-dollar company to take part and to create a website. You can do it for a few bucks yourself. Or it doesn't require you to have any specific technical knowledge even. You can use stuff like Squarespace to create websites for yourself. So that's the cool thing about the web, is that it's open, versus if you think about app stores, they're not exactly open. They're the opposite of open, where you have to pay Apple some fees and it's only specific for a specific platform, and all these things have restrictions around what you can and can't do on iOS, and which features you're allowed to ship and which features you're not allowed to ship. You have to sign some special agreements with Apple or Google and whatnot. So we believe that the web is cool because it's very, very open, and it stands for all this openness that comes from not being attached to any specific keeping business party.
Web browsers, their engines and web apps were absent from the DMA proposal tabled by the Commission in 2020, but by 2022, they had become explicit in the final DMA text. And do you have any, inside sense of what happened?
To be honest, we were very surprised when they turned up, because we only started our organization in 2021. And it was only at the end of 2021 we really started to get into thinking that digital regulation was the solution. We started with the CMA, And then we had multiple meetings with various EU DMA teams, and they were very nice and they understood the issues. And we explained, how big of a problem this was. But the response we kind of got from both teams was like, what you guys have got is great. It's just you're too late. We've already sent this off to the parliaments. Wish you'd come spoken to us a year or so ago. And that was from both, two separate units in the European Commission. And then we went to talk to the UK Competitions and Markets Authority, and we basically said to them, we're too late with the DMA, because obviously they've already pushed the legislation. I mean, really, this is one of our last avenues to basically save the mobile web, because it was literally that big of a deal. The mobile web is getting squeezed out by the gatekeepers' native ecosystems, and we didn't have any other regulator that was focused on it. And then within 2 weeks of that conversation, there was a draft of the DMA was getting circulated. And then in red, there was the, browsers, web apps, web applications were in the final text. And I don't actually know what conversations went behind the team, but there must have been something in that last couple of weeks that, made it into that final revision. So, yeah, we were very, very happy when that turned up.
Under the DMA, gatekeepers like Apple and Google are required to allow competing browser engines on iOS and Android. In practical terms, what does this obligation mean?
In order to be able to explain why Apple and Google are required to allow third parties to ship their own browser engines, perhaps we should first talk about what browser engines are, and then it will be easier to explain why they're required and why they're designated as gatekeepers in this area. Browser engines are, imagine when you use Google Chrome and Firefox, they have their own engines under the hood. Google Chrome uses this thing called Blink, and Firefox uses this thing called Gecko, and these are the engines that power these browsers. And Apple uses its own engine for Safari called WebKit. And as it turns out, Apple's browser engine is really, really outdated in a lot of ways. Like Google Chrome and Firefox and whatnot, these browsers as engines have 4,000 or 5,000 more APIs and features compared to Apple's own. So as a web developer, if you wish to build web apps, you have a lot more possibilities if you can use Google's and Firefox's engines, and you can't do those with Apple's WebKit engine. Google on Android has been doing incredibly well, and they actually allow other browser engines to exist on Android. So if you download Firefox, it actually does use Firefox's Gecko engine. Apple has a strange requirement that says if you wish to have your browser in our App Store, you have to use our Apple's browser engine, and you can't use your own browser engine. So when you install Google Chrome and use it, you're in fact using skinned Apple WebKit that just has a Chrome logo on it and a bunch of Chrome buttons and account features and whatnot on it. But under the hood, all browsers on iOS actually use Apple's WebKit. And this is one of the requirements Apple has in their App Store admission criteria. And that's a problem, because what if these other engines have a lot more features and they're better for competition and they are more advanced in security and privacy? And Apple simply said, nope, we are the only ones and the best ones who can offer this. If you want to be in the App Store, you're going to have to use our own engine. And thankfully, DMA stepped in and said, hey, if you wish to continue to operate in Europe, then you're going to need to allow third parties to ship their own browser engines. We could allow other browsers to compete with Apple's WebKit browser engine and ship their own engines. We could then use these browsers and their engines to build our web apps and be able to publish our web apps. We would then be able to do significantly more things than we would be able to do via the WebKit. And what's so cool about this is that Apple strategically blocked a few features in WebKit that makes web apps inferior and a worse experience for users than native apps. For example, for the longest time, Apple did not allow notifications for web apps. So even though on your desktop you can use Gmail in your browser and it's totally fine and you get a notification if you get an email, you couldn't do that on your phone because the web apps weren't allowed to send notifications, and it will be done, right? After 10, 12 years of delaying it in comparison to other browsers, they finally allowed it, but after they've established a dominance in App Store and after they've trained all their billions of users to know if you want an app, you go to the App Store, etc. So web apps essentially started off inferior, even though they had all these capabilities on every other platform. They were just lacking these features because Apple said no notifications. So if you want to build a to-do list app that has a reminder, forget about it. If you want to compete with Apple that way, forget about it. And these were the types of little things that made it difficult. On Android, this was possible, but it's very costly for platforms to have to do multiple different platforms, multiple different developments, and segment their users. The cool thing about web is that if you make a web app, it works on all platforms, on Linux, on Mac, on Windows, on iOS, on Android. You just develop it once and it works on all 5 places. So you just need to hire one engineering team that ships for all these places rather than hiring 5 teams that ships for these things separately and develops 5 times slower. So I think contestability in this context is going to allow browsers to bring their own engines and enable competition just by the virtue of being able to enable other companies to ship stuff and also compete with Apple themselves, with Apple's browsers themselves. And it's going to help with search revenues. It's going to help with potentially different business models for browsers. And DMA finally and amazingly required these gatekeepers to open up their platforms a little bit and said, hey, you know what? It's not cool if you force browsers to use your own engine. You need to allow them to use their own engines.
We are now almost 2 years into that obligation. How many independent browser engines are there on iOS?
So this is where it gets really interesting because Apple's put some really strange restrictions to browsers with their own engines. Apple said that, hey, you know what? It's okay if you want to bring your own engine, but you have to sign this really interesting contract called Browser Entitlement Contract. And in the contract, they require companies incredibly impossible or untenable things, legally speaking. Like they, for example, say, if you wish your browser to have an alternative browser engine, you cannot just push this as an update to your browser, but you have to have an entirely new app just for this. The users will have to download from scratch and have essentially 0 users, and they will be forced to leave behind all their existing users. And a side effect of this is that if your alternative browser engine browser starts from 0 users, then when you're presented with a choice screen, if you recall, choice screens show you the most popular browsers in each country based on the number of users. And it's going to be like this really strange situation where a lot of browser vendors have rightfully been pushing back and trying to explain that this is essentially emotional compliance and not cool. They keep claiming that this is about security, and they keep claiming that Apple's the best equipped party to be able to assess if something is secure or not. And when the UK's Competition Market Authority, CMA, actually pushed Apple to provide evidence to show this is in fact the case, Apple couldn't. And it's not about security because they couldn't show any evidence of this in the first place. If that were the case, they would just as easily show 10 pieces of evidence, I think. Reality is Apple says this is about security, but I think it's about the security of their income. So anyway, so nobody's ended up shipping yet. There's a bunch of stuff that we're in the process of making better, but unfortunately Apple hasn't bent yet, and we're still in a sort of a standstill, and we're making progress centimeter by centimeter.
If the gatekeepers themselves dislike the DMA more than any other regime, it must be doing something. And that's one of the things we've said to other regulators as well, is that you're never going to get the situation where the gatekeeper is going to voluntarily comply with something that's going to be effective, because anything effective is going to cost them billions of dollars and do significant harm to their control of their ecosystem. And so you're just always going to have that disbalance between what works and what they'd like to do, in which case you might as well go down the hard option and just go, right, we mandate that you open this up, that you share this functionality with your competitors, that you don't sign these anti-competitive deals to just force one particular product.
If Apple formally allows alternative web browser engines, but other contractual or technical barriers mean that none have been shipped so far, why hasn't this become a test case for anti-circumvention in your opinion? What's stopping it?
I suppose it's good to think about the Digital Markets Act in terms of practicalities. I remember from a very early conversation I had with the Digital Markets Act team when I asked how many people they were going to hire. And I think they said that at that point they were going to get 70. And I was like, oh, 70, is that all? And the reaction I got was one of surprise, because, obviously 70 in regulation sounds like quite a lot. But the problem is that your adversaries, one of which is Apple, has a legal budget of $1 billion per year. Now, when you're going up against a party that has a legal budget that dwarfs your own budget, it means you need to be quite careful when you're enforcing the regulation, making sure you've followed every single step, and that when you take it to court, you are going to win that battle. Because every battle lost in court means that it's going to weaken the digital regulation to everyone else. And so what I think that means in terms of the Digital Markets Act, there's a certain capacity about how many cases they can take on and process per year. And I think it's one of the biggest areas that the EU could look at improving is to expand the bandwidth of what the DMA could actually handle at one time. And then maybe we could get through more of these cases concurrently. And you have to realize Apple makes an enormous amount of money from Safari. They make, I think the last count was something like $22 billion per year, because they set Google search as the default and they get a revenue share agreement with Google. And so even if they lose 1% of market share globally, that's worth $200 million a year for them. So they will fight tooth and nail to protect browser share, including putting up all these stupid rules to prevent other competitors from getting into the market and actually being able to compete. Now, in terms of browser engines, we have made some progress over the last couple of years in that there's been a whole list of just ridiculous conditions that we've managed to overturn. A lot of those issues have been fixed. But the big one that is still a major sticking point is Apple has basically said that if you want to ship your browser to EU, you have to ship a brand new browser, right? And so you got to think about that from the browser company's point of view. Let's say you've got 20 million, or say you've got 10 million users in the EU, and they're in your Apple WebKit-based browser. Now what Apple's saying is they want you to bring out another browser and cannibalize your own market by migrating the users. Now, the thing is, we've already come up with easily workable solutions that are even jurisdictionally constrained with the EU. They can either allow both engines to live within a single app. You have two engines inside one app, and then you just have a toggle. If we're inside the EU, we use the real browser engine. If we're outside the EU, we use the WebKit one. That's just a contractual change. So to fix that one, all they need to do is go into one contract, change one line, and that problem's done. No technical changes needed whatsoever. If they don't want to do that, then they can get their engineers and they can build a distribution system that allows the browser vendors to ship two apps. They give Apple one app, which is the browser with the Apple engine, and then the browser with their own engine. And then once Apple has those apps, then they can decide which users they distribute those binaries to. So if they go, you're in the EU, okay, that means you can get the one with your own and ship it down to the user. And that's geographically constrained to the EU. And you can't argue against that because you're not trying to do any extra jurisdictional implementation of the DMA, but it also solves the problem for the browser vendors in that the existing base of 10 million users will gradually get swapped out with the new browser and transparently swapped in as well. So the users one day will be using the WebKit one, and then the next they'll be on the real browser engine. And the thing is, Apple doesn't want to do it because they know once that barrier's gone down, then that's suddenly going to make it viable for these other browser engines to get in and start competing.
How do regulatory developments outside the EU compare, and what looks most promising or most difficult at this stage?
From our perspective, the jurisdictions we've engaged with have been EU, UK, Japan, tiny bit with Korea, Australia, and a bit with one, and a little bit in the US as well. But in terms of the ones that are most far forward, obviously there's Japan's regulation, which came into force in December last year, but it's very new and it's only just got started. So we're going to have to wait to see the results of their interventions. The Japan one's not anywhere near as expansive as the DMA, but it still has a bunch of critical stuff, specifically prohibiting banning browser engines and allowing API access. The UK The DMCCA, which is the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act, is a very powerful piece of legislation. In fact, you could come up with more interventions under the DMCCA than you could with the DMA, because it's flexible and it allows the CMA to require bespoke conduct requirements individually for each area. But then obviously that does involve, you have to do the investigation and then do the conduct requirements. And it involves the willingness of the CMA to actually impose those conduct requirements. That kind of brings us to last month's proposal, and to be frank, some pretty weak voluntary commitments from Apple and Google, and especially from Apple's interoperability commitments, which basically doesn't obligate them to share anything. We weren't very impressed with what was on offer. And we actually wrote to the CMA just this week to say, we believe you should reject these commitments and instead focus on solid conduct requirements akin to what's in Article 6.7. Now, there are some groups who said they liked the proposed commitments, and I'll see if I can do a quote for you. It said, the commitments from Apple and Google are good news for small British app developers and a sensible solution for CMA concern. But unfortunately, that was from the App Association, who, according to 4 former employees, were funded directly by Apple behind the scenes. So although they claim to be on behalf of small developers, they're just, obviously look like a front group. What the App Association's website doesn't say is more than half of its estimated 9 million worth of sponsorships in 2020 came from one company, which was Apple. And then the ACCC, which is Australia's government consumer authority, as part of their digital platforms research. And then they handed that on to Australian Treasury to draft new digital regulation laws. But ever since that happened, just haven't heard anything since. And I haven't seen any news of anything happening at the moment. So my guess is perhaps they're waiting it out to see what happens in the rest of the world, and then they'll come in at some point and decide, once the geopolitical situations calm down a bit, whether they can step in and introduce some digital regulation. It's been a bit disappointing. It's just taken so long.
Both the EU, the DMA team, and the CMA team from the UK and the Japanese authorities, they've been all incredibly communicative and very helpful and very engaging in conversations that are extremely technical sometimes. It took a great deal of effort to understand how some of these things work. We spent a lot of time trying to explain to everyone how browser engines work. It makes me very happy to say that I think if you walked in the room now with the DMA workshops, I think the EC folks will be able to explain browser engines better than I can now. So they've been very helpful. We're very grateful. And I'm personally very grateful, speaking for myself and not just Open Web Advocacy. They've been very understanding and very accommodating towards smaller companies like myself. I have a tiny company compared to these multi-trillion-dollar conglomerates. So it's understandable that they might want to say, hey, this is a trade issue now. It's international geopolitics that's going to get involved. There's trillions of euros involved. They could rightfully so make decisions differently, but no, they still wanted to listen to us small folks, and that makes me very happy.
The DMA comes up for its first review. What do you think should be improved, clarified, or added?
I think when the DMA review comes up, a lot of people start thinking, what can we add to the DMA? Obviously, there is a bandwidth constraint on the DMA team with how many different parallel things they can enforce. And one of the things that we need to focus on is we need to make sure what's already in the DMA is already enforced, possibly before appending any new categories of enforcement. So not really changing the DMA, but increasing the budget of the DMA team, or looking at other ways to contribute resources so that they could take on more concurrent cases. In terms of fixes for the DMA, there's a whole bunch of little things that I think could be improved. So, for example, in Article 6.3, there's an annoying clause which says, at moment of end of the end user's first use of a search engine, browser or identity service. The problem with that is that constrains where you can pop up the choice screen, when really everybody in the industry thinks it should go in device setup Apple has made it when you tap Safari, it pops up the choice screen, which in a way strengthens Safari somewhat because they see the Safari icon and then perhaps they're more likely to set Safari once that pops up rather than moving it to the setup of the device. One of the biggest things I did think was missing from the DMA, there's no general anti-self-preferencing clause, which makes it very hard to argue about things where the gatekeeper is allowing competition, but they're pushing their product more than the competitor. Whereas it's probably much better for competition where all services are given an equal footing on the device, even if that requires, a few extra taps from the user. I think the competition advantages outweigh any slight ease of use advantages. The other thing is possibly having a line about strengthening. We think we're probably still covered by the existing DMA, but it's possible we might need something that strengthens the legal argument that web apps need to be supported by the operating system. It's possible we could get that under 6.4, but it's not as concrete as we'd like. There was a great section in the DMCCA that we really did like, and that was section 23, which was using a position relevant in relation to the relevant digital activity to treat its own products more favorably than those of other undertakings, or restricting interoperability between the relevant service and products offered by other undertakings, or restricting the ability or users or potential users to use other products of other undertakings, which really is heading towards a general anti-self-preferencing clause. And obviously, they can make conduct requirements based on that. And so that's something that we could add to DMA that would make it a lot stronger.
How could generative AI affect the open web, and what might that mean for future big tech regulation?
Yeah, that's very interesting. I actually think the open web is very important for the AI revolution overall. Because if you think about AI, it works best when the distribution of it is open. And it's most transformative when sort of new entrants into the market, and obviously we've seen quite a lot of new entrants in the market over the last few years. If they can get onto the market and they can reach users quickly, they can iterate quickly, and then they can mix and combine with, other services that are available. And the thing is, the open web really supports that model better than anyone, because a new competitor can launch a site and prove it continuously and have it available across all platforms. The problem with Gen AI and AI in general and the native ecosystems is the native ecosystems suddenly take control of distribution, updates, billing, discovery, and all this core functionality between the gatekeeper control. And gatekeepers have their own AI fiefdoms to protect. And so what we're at a risk of is that we're at a risk of getting a future of AI which is shaped less by who builds the best product and more by who gets the best access to the operating system, app store, default positions. And the thing is, if we have the web as a competitor, they can reach the users easily, whereas the native ecosystems reinforce this vertical integration. And that's really what the gatekeepers want to do. The gatekeepers want to control the entire stack. They want to control the AI model, they want the cloud, they want the interface, they want the operating system, they want the app store, they want the browser, they want search, and then they want to bundle all together. They want to make it the default. They want to subsidize it with monopoly rents, deny competition equivalent access, and then push their service up. And so we need to prevent that sort of lock-in from happening if we really want true competition between these new generative AI startups.
From your open web advocacy role, what lessons have you drawn so far from working with the DMA and with regulators, and what type of advocacy efforts have been the most successful so far, and what do you believe was the key to that success?
I think we learned lots of lessons. The first lesson, it's never going to be a short process. It's always going to be a very long battle with whatever you're fighting for. It's just because even though the digital regulation is supposed to be a sort of a fairly nimble process by antitrust comparisons, it still requires a lot of research, a lot of evidence, a lot of meetings, documents, explanations, and then obviously a lot of counter arguments to whoever your opposing party is. I suppose one of the things we worked out early on is that early on we would come and try and go, here is the comprehensive solution to solve everything. Like if there's right, if you want to fix digital markets, here are 100 things that you need to do. I think that was an important lesson, is that regulators have limited bandwidth and they can only really focus on a small number of things at one time. And so it's important to focus, to cut the less important things from your list and do the important ones first. And because we have had problems in the past where we have had number 10 on the list and 10's got a lot of focus. And it's like, hang on, we need to do number one first. In general, though, obviously, regulators are made of smart people, technologists, economists, lawyers, and it basically comes down to explain what the problem is, explain how to fix it, and give a range of options on how to fix it. And then at the end of the day, explain why it's better for consumers and businesses if that regulator compels the gatekeeper to do the change that you're hoping to make, and then back it up with as much evidence as possible. And that's one of the things that we spend a lot of time on. Is obviously we're not experts in everything, but we go off and we talk to a huge range of experts and we collate all that information together, reword it so it's actually understandable, and then we give it back to the regulator. And then we say, do you want to have a meeting? Do you want us to explain anything? Send us requests for comments. And I think that's what gives you movement on those particular issues. And then more than anything, perseverance. You just have to keep going. You have to have a lot of allies. And one of the great things about working with civil society organizations is that we all have similar goals, but kind of in different tracks. And when we have a shared interest in something, we'll just ping each other and like, all right, so what are you working on in this particular area? And then you can support each other in achieving basically what's a shared goal. And I think having allies is another really important part of, fighting the good fight and fighting for sort of fairer digital regulation.